Well, good evening, all of those of you who are joining us online this morning or this evening as we come together and we're re-recording a message from last Sunday because technology didn't want to play nice with us, so we're re-recording a message and so we can get it online so you guys can have access to it forever. So I just want to take a second, look in the camera. If you're joining us online this evening and you're like, what's going on? Why is New Day live right now? That's why. We had some technical difficulties last week. We got a whole whopping 23 seconds of video before the live stream cut out. And there was 23 of you that watched the 23 seconds. So thank you so much for enjoying our 23 seconds last week. Anyways, so last week we started off by looking at, looked at the fact that the people that were closest to Jesus, that learned from him and ate with him and talked with him and walked with him and they were living life with Jesus, they thought they got it wrong about what Jesus was teaching and doing when Jesus was nailed to the cross, right? But then Jesus did this thing that changed everything. He rose from the dead. And all of a sudden it was now what? And the early church had this resurrection religion, okay, well, if we look at the fact that Jesus predicted his own birth and his own death and his own burial and his own resurrection and all this stuff happened, and he is who he says he is, what do we do? And then in Acts 15, they had the first ever church staff meeting where they came together and they decided, well, we can't go back and we can't re-embrace and we can't do the things the way that we used to with the temple model approach. That would have left us all out of the equation as soon as the temple came crashing down in about 71 AD when they ripped the temple and every stone of the temple down off the Temple Mount, right? And most of Jesus' teachings centered around himself and who he was in the future, and he told us a lot of parables and a lot of things, and then right before he goes to the cross, he gave us all this one new commandment to love one another as I have loved you, which at the time didn't make no sense, and then we were left with all these Jesus' odd assortments of commandments as they were remembered by the 11 who walked with him and talked with him and ate with him and broke bread with him. These commandments would fuel the movement for the first 20 plus years of the church, right? These commandments, they were impossible to imagine before the resurrection, but they were made possible by the fact that there was a resurrection, that Jesus did rise from the dead, that he's no longer dead. He left the tomb. He conquered death. It made all these impossible things possible. And if Jesus is whom he says he was, and now that he's risen from the dead, we know that he is who he says he was, then of course we should follow what we are calling his commandments, right? Suddenly what sounded so extreme wasn't extreme at all. And it made many of those other very complex Old Testament commandments unnecessary. His weren't really commandments in the traditional sense of thou shalt not. They were more attitudes and approaches and perspectives, or another way that we call them the uncommandments, right? They were unusual. They were uncomplicated. They were unexplainable, right? And today, this evening, as you're joining us, we're confronted with the end commandment that has been twisted really more than any of the other commandments, the end commandments that we're going to look like, right? And it's a command that sounds one way before the crucifixion and before the resurrection, but on the other side of the coin, it's completely different on the other side, post-resurrection and post-crucifixion. It has a completely different connotation. But unfortunately, pastors and Christians and people like me that quote Jesus, we often give what we're talking about today a pre-death and pre-resurrection tone, right? So the cool thing about what we're talking about today is where this event that we're going to talk about actually happened, and it happened here. This is Temple Mount. This is where the temple back in the first century would have stood. This is where all the Israelites, the Jewish people, would have climbed up these stairs in Jerusalem to go to the temple to celebrate and do their offerings and their sin sacrifices. This is the place right here. This is the modern day Temple Mount. And Perhaps the most significant thing about this is that this is where the encounter that Jesus had took place, was right here on top of Temple Mount, the thing that we're going to look about. This is where it happened. It took place on top of the Temple Mount, just outside of what we call the Holy of Holies, or the temple, right? Now, here's another picture of the Temple Mount. This is the present day site of what it looks like, and there are really three prominent dominating monumental structures that are on top of it. And these structures, like you have the mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the bottom. You have the Dome of the Rock, which they believe is actually where the Holy of Holies was, is centered. And then right off to the, if you're looking at the picture just to the right of the Dome of the Rock, you see like a little gray dome thing. That's the Dome of the Chains. And it's just, those are the three big monuments that are on top of it. The mosque, obviously, is what when the Muslims took over the Temple Mount after the temple was destroyed, they built a mosque, and that's the mosque. And it's, again, so that's what it looks like current day, modern day there. And if you have an opportunity to visit Jerusalem, I've never been myself, some of you might have been, I've been told you need to make sure that you visit what is referred to as the Southern Steps. The Southern Steps. This is what the Southern Steps look like today. Steps. This is a massive set of steps, and it's located along the southern wall of the temple, and in the first century, it led to the primary entrance of the temple on the Temple Mount, right? So we know with certainty that Jesus himself climbed these steps on many occasions as he's made his way into the temple, right? And Luke tells us that Joseph and Mary brought Jesus to Jerusalem every year for Passover. And when he was about 12, he wandered off by himself and he made his way up these stairs. And for 3 days, he hung out in the temple courtyards. And he with the teachers of the law, and he asked questions. And apparently, he answered a few questions while he was there at the age of 12. For Jewish worshipers, these steps were more than a method of entering and exiting the temple. Like, these steps really represented the path into the very presence of God, right? Because the Holy of Holies was where they housed the Ark of the Covenant and the tablets of stone in which contained the laws that God had given them according to Exodus 31 that was inscribed by the finger of God. Now, a couple weeks ago, my son JJ, he spoke at another church with his youth group that he attends, and he told a joke during his message that I thought was fitting and worked perfectly for this message. So I'm going to share this joke. I did not create this joke. I don't know where he got it, but it's a fantastic joke. I thought it was funny, so I want to share it with you. And that joke is simply this. Did you know that Moses was the biggest sinner in the entire Bible? Yeah, that's right. He sure was. He broke all 10 commandments at once. Okay, I don't know if you're laughing or not. I thought that was funny. I think it's funny. I laugh at it every time I think about it. It gives me a chuckle, right? Anyways, that's just food for thought. Take that, do whatever you want with it. Anyways, so that's what makes what we're looking at today, the following account, so significant. While we aren't sure when the following event might have actually taken place, we know for sure where it took place. And it took place in the temple courtyard just outside the Holy of Holies, where they were probably came up the southern stairs, and Jesus is in the, okay, anyways. We're going to pick it up in John chapter 8, starting in verse 2. We're going to go through a lot of chapter 8, and it starts off like this. Early in the morning, that's Jesus, came again into the temple, which means that we know he came into the temple, probably up the southern steps, and all the people were coming to him, and they sat down, and he began to teach them. And the scribes and the Pharisee brought a woman. So picture this with me. Here they are. And if I had to guess, they weren't politely just escorting this woman to Jesus. They were probably dragging her. So they probably drugged this woman up those southern steps of the temple, which means they had to be keeping her somewhere all night, saving her for what is about to happen. Which, okay, that's not right either, right? So anyways, verse 3, she was caught in adultery. And having set her in the center of the courtyard, okay, so they're in the center of the court. They're saying, okay, we're in the temple court, right in the middle, right outside the Holy of Holies where God's presence is. And they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in adultery in the very act of it." Now, if you don't know this was one of the big tens. The big 10 commandments, the original 10 commandments that God inscribed on the tablet that Moses broke and made him the biggest sinner in the Bible, right? Anyways, in Exodus 20, verse 14, I'm reading out of the King James Version, the original version of the Bible, and it says this: "Thou shalt not commit adultery." It doesn't get much clearer than that, right? So can you imagine this? Can you imagine this? Like this had to be the last place in the world that this woman wanted to be at this moment in time, right? Because the temple was so much more than just a temple. The temple at that moment was a monument to her sin. It was a monument to her shame. It was a monument of her distance from God. Right? Verse 5, we're picking it up. "Now in the law," which, by the way, Jesus, if you forgot, is right over there in the Holy of Holies. It's sitting right over there. Do we want to go read it with us? If you forgot what it says, we could go over there, take it, just in case you forgot, Jesus, what it says. "Moses commands us to stone such women. What then do you say?" Which is interesting. What Jesus could have said is, "Then why did you bring her all the way up here? Why didn't you just take her out into the valley and stone her? You already know what the law says. Why are you bringing her to me?" What he could have said also was, "Hey, God squad, what Moses actually said is this: if a man commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, both the man and the woman have committed adultery, must be put to death." Now, let's look at this. Let's see. First off, these Pharisees and scribes have drug a woman up to Jesus that's been caught in adultery. Where's the other part of the equation? She can't commit adultery by herself. Oh yeah, where's the dude? Where's the guy? Again, this is just another version of the temple model temple model thinking. That it was sacred men, these Pharisees and these scribes and these religious leaders using the sacred text, the Old Testament, the law and the covenant, and the law and the prophets to have their own personal sacred way in life. And Jesus, that's not what Jesus was all about. Because in verse 6, it tells them they were saying this, testing him, so that they might have the grounds for accusing him. What were they trying to accuse him of? What were they trying to get him to do? So there's no consequence that they drug her up these stairs and into the temple court to ask Jesus this question. Because here's what was important for them at that time. For the crowd, they wanted the crowd, right? Because everywhere Jesus went, there was the few, the proud, and the crowd. The few, the proud, and the crowd. You had those three people that were really close to Jesus. Then you had the 12, and typically you had this big crowd that was going with Jesus. He had more than just the 12 disciples. There was the 72 that he sent out at one point. And then you had the bigger crowd, the 5,000 that he was feeding. So he always had this crowd of people around him. And these religious leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and the law teachers, they all always had a mission to try to get the crowd against Jesus. Because if they could turn Jesus against the crowd, then they had him. So it was always Jesus versus Moses. It was always Jesus versus the temple. It was always Jesus versus their Bible at the time, which we call the Old Testament, which they referred to as the law and the prophets. They were not concerned about the well-being or even the guilt of the woman they had drugged before Jesus. They didn't care. And the thing is, legalistic people rarely are worried about the guilt or the well-being of the person that they're accusing of something. Their concern was turning the crowd against Jesus. So their question behind the question was this: Jesus, do you consider yourself greater than all of this? Do you consider yourself greater than the sacrificial system in the temple that God gave us? Do you consider yourself greater than the traditions and the customs that we have held our nations together for thousands and thousands of years? They knew that if they could create any kind of daylight, any kind of gap between his teachings and Moses' teachings, they had them, especially in the light of the fact that they were standing in the temple courtyard. But Jesus, verse 6, but Jesus stooped down with his finger and wrote in the ground, in the dirt, in the ground. It probably wasn't paved, it was probably dust, and he started writing in the dirt. Here's the interesting thing. Jesus could have went big. Jesus could have went, you're right, take her out, stone her. What did Jesus do? No, Jesus went to the ground. He went eye to eye with her. He stoops down to her level. Can you imagine the drama at this moment? So much drama. They're there, and they're like, what is he doing? He stoops down and he starts writing in the dirt, and they're like, what is going on, right? But verse 7, they said, but they persisted in asking him. So he stands back up, he straightens up, and he says to them, he who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw the stone at her. Don't miss this drama. Don't miss this, right? Jesus turns the table on them. While they're standing on the hill that they themselves had climbed dozens and dozens and dozens of times throughout their lives to make sacrifices for their very own sin, he was like, for the one among you who've never sinned, you cast the first stone. And the crazy thing is that there was one among them that had no sin, that actually lived without sin. And you know what he did? He stooped back down to her level. He stooped down to your level. He stooped down to my level. And he is literally at that moment in time physically illustrating what the gospel, which he came to implement, is all about, in which he came and the reason he came. Again, verse 8, it says again, he stooped down and started writing on the ground. Here's the interesting thing. Have you ever wondered what he wrote? Have you ever thought about that? Like, have you ever tried to consider, like, what was Jesus writing in that dirt at that moment? Because it's interesting to think. Here's personally my favorite. He started writing their mistress's name. Of those guys that were standing on top of the Temple Mount with him, that were accusing this woman of being in adultery. Sally. Becky. Maybe it wasn't even mistress's name. Maybe it was sins. Adultery. Thievery. We don't know. But what an amazing thought process, because what happens next is crazy. When they heard this, they began to go out. Imagine this, imagine the drama here. They began to go out down the very stairs that they drugged this woman up just not too long ago. One by one, beginning with the older ones. The ones who had probably made the most trips up those southern stairs to the altar. To the point where verse 9 tells us that he was left alone and the woman where she was. He was alone with her in the center of the court. And once again, Jesus would straighten up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Where are they? Did no one condemn you?" And she would look and say to Jesus, "No one, Lord. No one." There was no one left that had just drug her up the stairs to condemn her and accuse her of this crime, of this sin. And Jesus said, "I do not condemn you either." And then he gives her, gives you, gives me, gives us an end commandment. Go. First off, it's go. It's an imperative. It's kind of like, it's like, hey, you've messed up. You're sitting in your junk. You've done something wrong. But the first thing you need to do is pick yourself up and go on about your life. Yes, you've messed up. Yes, you've done something regrettable. Yes, you, as we like to say in America, made a mistake. Even though that mistake has a name. Even though that mistake has a name that you've talked to and texted and talked to about a whole bunch of times. Go on about your life. Go. From now on, sin no more. Or in other words, sin not. Sin not. Every sin comes prepackaged with a penalty. And the consequence of sin is the reason Jesus urged her to leave her life of sin. Go, leave it. Don't turn back. Don't be like the people that just always try to but then come back to it. Because the consequence of sin is the reason Jesus urged you to leave your life of sin. And that sin, the wages of sin is death, is what the Bible tells us. And a lot of times, that death might not be a physical death. In some cases, your sin can be a physical death. But there is a cost. And you can be certain the tone changes because just a few weeks later, just a few weeks after, potentially after this moment where Jesus is like, "Go and sin no more. I do not condemn you." Jesus would be nailed to a cross and die for her adultery. He would die for your adultery. In other words, your sin, my sin, killed Jesus. And there's no point in allowing sin to kill you when God sent his son to die for you, to pay the debt in which you could never pay. God is for you. That is the context and the filter for which everything we should read, everything we should feel, and everything that we experience should be looked at. Is the fact that Jesus came. He told us to go and sin no more. Sin not. Thou shalt not sin. And then he died and he punctuated the fact that here's why you can sin not. So we're going to go over a few applications real quick. Okay? And the first one is this: sin not, which basically is to go and sin no more. Not because if you go and sin again, God's going to get you. But because sin will eventually kill you. Whether it's a spiritual death, whether it's a physical death, whether it's an emotional death, it doesn't matter. At some point in time, sin will kill you. You will become numb to whatever it is. If it's a sexual sin, you will become sexually numb and you will not be able to love your husband, love your wife the way that God has designed because you are numb to the effects of what true intimacy is. It will kill you. Sin not. Why? Ultimately, it will cause you to hate you. God loves you. And some of you have felt judged by the church, by people like me. And the truth is, in a lot of cases, in most cases, the church never judged you. You judged you. You condemned you. And what was actually happening is you were coming to a place where people were loving you, and that you came to a place where there was a family of believers that knew that lived in sin and experienced sin the same way you did. And that moment in time at the church, it reminded you of what you don't like about you. Which is why Jesus says to go and leave your life of sin. If you don't leave the life of sin, eventually, ultimately, you're not going to like you. And if you don't like you, you can't fulfill the one commandment Jesus gave us, to love as I have loved. Because if you hate you, that's just going to be what pours out of your heart. You're so mad and angry at yourself, you're not going to love people the way Jesus loves them, because you can't love yourself. Sin not. Sin is not your master. And we have this weird mentality in America. We like to say, we don't like this word sin. We like to say, I've made a mistake. That mistake might have a name, and you've made that mistake more than once over the last week, over the last month. Right? A lot of you that are watching, a lot of you that have seen this, a lot of you have heard me say that your greatest regrets in your life come with a name attached to it. And when Jesus died, sin's death grip on you died with him. Here's the crazy thing. You can say no. You can. And here's the kicker. You have to choose to. You can say no when you choose to. So you living in a life of sin, instead of going and sinning no more, that is your choice. You're deliberately choosing to make the mistake. It's more than a mistake, it is sin. And God has told us to leave our life of sin, to go, get out of the muck. Don't stand where you are. Stop standing in the trash that is your life, and get out of there. Go. Leave your life of sin. So I'm going to wrap this whole thing up with a few questions. And then I'm going to pray, and then we're going to go on about our business. Now I want to end this with the first question is this. What is your sin? As we've been discussing, as we've been talking about this, and we looked at these things, and what is your sin? What is that thing that you call a mistake that you realize now is so much more than a mistake? That it really is sin. And it's killing you. It's making you hate yourself, and you can't